How did you get involved in this particular subject?
So there's a production company, Marwar Junction, and they had actually sold this show to Peacock, and they were looking for a director. So this is the first show that I've made or helped to make that I haven't been involved in the sort of conception of the story from the jump. So they had developed the story and sold it to Peacock, and they were shopping for a director, and they liked my work, and so they hired me to make it.
And so did you have any experience with the Krishnas before this?
No. And I had like a lot of people, I had a lot of misconceptions about them. Like I thought that there was that the Hare Krishna movement was invented in America in the 1960s. I just had it associated with sort of the hippie movement, and that's not the truth of it. It is at all. It's like actually a spiritual tradition that dates back thousands of years, like far predates Christianity. It's based in these ancient spiritual texts called the Vedas that. The written version is like at least 3,500 years old, and the oral tradition goes back thousands of years beyond that. So I learned a lot about, the Krishna consciousness and the making of this. And the show is about a particularly dark chapter in the history of the movement in the 70s and 80s that I don't think is representative of the movement like today. Like I think it's a force for good in the world today, actually.
Yeah, I think the principles behind it, if you pay attention to the main guru, what was the older gentleman?
Prabhupada, yeah.
Yeah, my friend Duncan loves that guy.
Yeah.
And what the whole concept behind it sounds beautiful. It's all just love and, relinquishing your possessions and the hold that they have on you and just living this very peaceful, loving life and not just forgiving your enemies, but letting them into your home. And all of it sounds great. But all it takes is one psycho.
Yeah, one psycho. Well, Prabhupada, he took a risk. So Prabhupada was a guru. So several gurus, Krishna consciousness gurus, had come over from India to the UK or to the US, in the 1800s even, and then through the first half of the 20th century, and had no luck because their timing wasn't right or they weren't the right person or both. But Prabhupada was the right dude at the right time. He showed up in Greenwich Village, New York City in 1965 and started preaching Krishna consciousness, and it just took off like wildfire. And, like Allen Ginsberg got down with it. Wasn't maybe a full-scale devotee, but like he was hanging out with them. But Prabhupada was already an old dude when he showed up in the U.S. And so in 1977, he died. So that's 12 years. And by that time, Krishna consciousness, there were like Krishna temples all over the country and in the UK because George Harrison had converted, right? That was one of his like strokes of brilliance, Prabhupada, is he like sent a group of devotees to go camp out outside the Apple Records office and just like chant and dance until they basically got a meeting with the Beatles. And he was literally like, let's see if we can make the Beatles, Krishnas. And with Harrison, it took. And that song, My Sweet Lord, that's what it's about. That's about Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
So, but when Prabhupada died in 1977, he hadn't had a lot of time to build up successors, and most of the leaders of the movement were young, or most of the members of the movement were young. So he took a risk, and I don't think he had a choice. And he appointed 11 of his closest, longest time devotees, all men, to be the gurus that would carry the movement forward. And while you could say that it worked and that Krishna consciousness is still around and is bigger than ever, a few of those, these are dudes. These are like dudes in their 20s, okay, that suddenly are being worshipped as direct conduits to the divine. In other words, treated as gods on earth.
Yeah.
And some of them were not spiritually prepared for that.
Yeah.
Would be a kind way to put it. And some of them went wrong, and one of them in particular, Kirtanananda, whose government name was Keith Ham, went really wrong.
I like the term government name.
Yeah. But we were there to film. There's this ceremony. These two brothers whose father, his name was Chakadari, his Christian name. His government name was Charles St. Denis. He's also known as Chaka in the movement. And his sons were doing this really ancient ritual to sort of release the soul of someone who's been murdered. And so they had their father's ashes, which he was murdered, decades ago at New Vrindavan on orders from Kirtanananda because he was challenging Kirtanananda's authority.
So Kirtanananda had people murdered too?
Yeah.
More than one?
Yeah. I think there's probably quite a few bodies
that
up in the hills.
People just don't know about?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, one of the principal sources for the documentary is a guy who's a retired homicide cop named Thomas Westfall, who was a local cop in West Virginia when the Krishnas set up shop at the New Vrindavan commune. And so he started keeping a close eye on them early and sort of saw Kirtananda's rise to power. And, he believes that there's at least a handful more victims up there whose bodies haven't been found. Because it's really remote country. I mean, I don't want to stress that. It's really cold in the winter. There's a lot of snow. To this day, it's a difficult place to get to.
And so this guy, when he first started running this temple, this area, when did it go? How long did it take before it went sideways?
Well, I think it was the question with Kirtananda or Keith Ham is always like, was he bent before he became a Krishna, or was it like, did the power get to him? And I think it's both. I think he had a psychological disposition towards being a despot, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then once Prabhupada was gone, and Kirtananda, along with 10 of his compatriots, was appointed a guru, and had that sort of power. I think at that point and combined with like all the money. I mean, he had this guy that was Kirtananda was a genius at running schemes and scams to make money. He would dispatch like the hottest young female Krishna devotees to like stock car races and rock concerts and stuff to like raise money for whatever. They just make it up, the starving children of India, or they just make up charities. And they'd flirt with dudes, especially at rock concerts, guys that are like high, and get them to give them cash, $1 here, $5 here, $10 there. They'd work at airports too, but and they just brought in literally like garbage bags full of cash, every week.
Wow.
And he trained them to deposit it in $9,900 increments,
so it doesn't
to avoid the reporting.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So he looks crazy. That's what's interesting. Isn't it interesting that like crazy people look crazy? And I always try to say, okay, is this because he's crazy, or do you see something? It's hard to tell, but he doesn't seem enlightened. Like
right.
You look at him, he looks like a guy who's a little unhinged. And I've met people like that, unhinged. And I've met people like that in like the psychedelics movement. And there's a few of these movements that are so open, and basically anybody can become a part of it. The concept behind it is, we're all seeking enlightenment. And then you'll see someone who gets in there and you're like, what is, this guy's a schizophrenic or something. Like, there's something going on here.
Especially you look at photos of Kirtananda over the decades. Mm-hmm. Like he just gets more and more and more demented looking.
Right. And that has to probably be the power. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
They're washing his feet and worshiping him.
Yeah, and he was molesting kids there, too.
Yeah.
Like he was a total pedophile.
Right. Do you think that started, that he was always a pedophile?
I think pedophiles are always pedophiles, But again, once he had like access to, as the movement went on, more and more Krishna couples had kids, so he had access to more and more and more children up there, in those hills. Right,
and that was one of the things that you highlight, is that it wasn't just about releasing the possessions; it was also like not having control of your children either.
Yeah. Although I think they especially at New Vrindavan, at the place that Kirtananda ran, they kind of took that belief, that yes, children are a material attachment, right? But he took it to an extreme and basically cut off, kids from their parents, like entirely. And that was not unique to New Vrindavan. That happened in a lot of temples around the country in the U.S. But ISKCON,
and the pedophilia happened in these temples as well?
But I will say, again, to ISKCON's credit, that unlike the Catholic Church, once the evidence started to emerge that there had been, I think it's fair to say, systemic, raping of kids at their religious facilities, they addressed the issue head on. And for the most part, I think have done an excellent job of, weeding out the pedos.
And what happened to the kids? Because it's not just that, it seems like it wasn't isolated. It was all the kids.
At New Vrindavan?
Yeah. I mean, this is what you're kind of
Mostly boys, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly boys. Yeah.
Yeah.
They have communities online, and there's a lot of bitterness. You know, it varies. It varies. You can't totally generalize, but you know, the kids that grew up in New Vrindavan, you know, they have online communities where there's a lot of, like, for obvious reasons, like resentment and bitterness and anger.
Yeah, obviously.
Still at the leadership of the Hare Krishna movement for not, in their opinion, you know, fully atoning for the sins that occurred there.
Wow, what could they do?
Right.
I mean,
well, there was a settlement. There were some lawsuits. There were some settlements. But, I mean, you know,
that
money
doesn't
only
fix
no,
anything.
No.
It doesn't fix anything. It acknowledges that something happened, but you're ruining a child for life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're doing it in the most evil way because you're supposed to be a part of this peace and love movement that's like the optimal way to live life.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why this guy, Charles St. Denis, Chaka, was murdered, is he was calling out Kirtananda for his hypocrisy. Now, I don't know if he called him out for the, you know, raping kids, but, like, Kirtananda was having, like, gay sexual relationships with some laborers that had been hired to come help build the temple that weren't necessarily devotees. And it was like an open secret, you know, in the commune. And he called him out for it, and also called him out for the materialism, for, like, driving around in a limousine, for having, like, you know, they would buy him a new, you know, fancy SUV every year or whatever, you know. And Charles St. Denis called him on his bullshit publicly, and that's what got him killed.
Wow. Yeah. Fuck, man. It's I know quite a few people that grew up in cults. You know, in stand-up comedy, you deal with a lot of, like, lost people,
right,
like wayward folks that just didn't fit in anywhere in society. And a couple of my friends, one of my good friends, grew up a Jehovah's Witness. And, you know, it's just you live in this world that is this very strange sort of, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. It's crazy. It doesn't fit. And once you start questioning things, you find, like, you're not allowed to. And it's just very bizarre how many of these. Like, I was having a conversation with Mark Andreessen, you know, the venture capitalist guy, and he was like, California still has a lot of active cults right now. I was like, really? He goes, oh, yeah, there's a lot. So, like, there's ones you don't hear about where they kind of keep it together.
Right.
So I guess there's, like, cults have to go completely, like, holy hell sideways before you get a documentary.
Right.
So some of them, they figure out how to kind of keep everybody together.
It's probably harder to keep shit under wraps these days than it was for Kirtananda in the 70s and 80s.
With the internet. Yeah, for sure.
Everybody's got a phone. And
It's also, like, people are much more aware of what a cult is now. I bet in the 1960s, it just seemed like a beautiful alternative to, you know, I mean, you're dealing with the civil rights movement, Jim Crow, anti-war movement, Vietnam is happening. You've got Richard Nixon's the president. There's all this chaos. People don't want the world that's in front of them right now, and they're searching for some alternative. Then it comes along. Oh, what about love? What about this? Yeah, that's what I want.
Right.
And then next thing you know, you're wrapped up in this thing.